Welcome to Cheat Sheet Tale, where secrets slip, lies unravel, and the truth always has a twist. Real stories, raw confessions, and shocking betrayals. Drop a comment if you've ever caught a red flag too late. Now let's get into today's tale. So, let me start by giving some background here. I'm a woman in my late 30s, and I come from a big family, like a really big family. The kind of family where every holiday is an event. Thanksgiving in particular has always been huge in our household. Growing up, it was always one of those days that I looked forward to with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Because let's be honest, hosting so many people, even if they're family, is never stress-free, but this year I was determined to do it all myself. I wanted it to be perfect. I thought I had everything planned. And for the most part, I did. I knew that Thanksgiving was going to be at my place this year. We had been planning it for months. I volunteered to host because, frankly, I enjoy cooking, and there's something really satisfying about knowing you're the one who's bringing everyone together under one roof. I took on the responsibility of making dinner, decorating the house, and making sure everyone had a place to lie. Said it wasn't just about the food, though. It was about the family time, the laughter, and the togetherness that makes Thanksgiving so special. I spent hours in the kitchen preparing turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, and all the sides that go with it. My house smelled like heaven, and everything was set for a fantastic evening. People began to arrive, and the house filled up with chatter. The table was laid out beautifully, and I couldn't wait to dig in. Everyone was having a good time catching up with each other, chatting about their lives, and of course, getting into the holiday spirit with some drinks. It was all going smoothly until about halfway through the evening when something unexpected happened. My cousin, let's call her Vivian, came up to me with an excited look on her face. She told me that some of her friends were out celebrating and that they were really close by, and she asked if it would be okay if they came over at first. I was a little surprised, but I said no problem. Figuring it would be a few people, maybe some close friends who had nothing to do for the evening, but then things took a weird turn as more cousins and aunts started chiming in. I realized that this wasn't just a few friends. It was an entire group. I could feel the tension building in my chest as Vivian told me, "It'll be fun. They'll only stay for a little while. It's not a big deal." But to me, it was a huge deal. I had specifically planned for this Thanksgiving to be a family-only gathering. I had a set number of seats at the table. I had accounted for how much food I made. And let's not forget, this was my house. The thought of throwing a big, loud party in the middle of what was supposed to be a cozy family dinner didn't sit well with me. I asked Vivian to cancel the invitations, explaining that I hadn't agreed to any of this. It was my home, my celebration, and I just wanted to enjoy a peaceful evening with those I had invited. She didn't understand at first and started protesting, saying I was being too uptight and that it wouldn't be a problem. But I wasn't backing down. I firmly told her that if they wanted to have a party, they could go somewhere else. My house wasn't the place for it at this point. Things started to get a little heated. Some of my other relatives jumped in, telling me not to ruin the mood and that it would be a good time to mingle. With friends, they all started pressuring me, asking me to relax, to let it go, but I couldn't. I had already said no, and I wasn't about to change my mind just to appease everyone else. I insisted again that they cancel the invitations and stop bringing people over, and after some back and forth, they seemed to agree. They promised they would tell their friends to stay away. And I thought, okay, maybe we've reached a resolution. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was just too sudden. It felt like this was far from over. About half an hour later, I was sitting in the living room trying to enjoy the last of the calm before it was time to serve dessert. When I heard the doorbell ring, I looked at my partner, and we both froze. I knew exactly what was happening. I stood up and rushed toward the door. When I opened it, there were a group of unfamiliar faces standing on my doorstep, clearly excited to be let in. And right behind them was my aunt with a huge smile on her face, welcoming them in. I was absolutely floored. She had gone ahead and let them in without even checking with me first. I stood there, completely in shock. For a few moments, this wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening in my own house. My Thanksgiving dinner, my home, was being hijacked by people I didn't know. My heart was racing. I felt like everything I had worked for, everything I had planned, was slipping away in an instant. It wasn't even about the food anymore. It wasn't about the guests or the seating arrangements. It was about respect, boundaries, and the fact that I had said no. My aunt and cousins had completely ignored that. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm, but I was fuming. I didn't want to scream or cause a scene, but at the same time, I couldn't just stand there and let this happen. I didn't want a party. I didn't want strangers in my house. I didn't want to be stuck with a chaotic group of 20 people. When I had carefully planned for just my family, I asked everyone to leave. I didn't yell. I wasn't rude, but I made it clear that this wasn't acceptable. I told them the holiday was over. My voice was firm but calm as I told them they had to go. There was no negotiation. I had already given them a chance to fix things, and they had ignored me. I could feel the tension in the room as my relatives stood there. Frozen in shock, some of them looked embarrassed, others looked angry, but no one said anything. Vivian and a couple of others tried to argue, but I stood my ground. The holiday is over. Everyone needs to go. They all left, most of them without a word. I watched as the group of over 20 people, most of whom didn't even know me, filed out of my house. I stood there, stunned. My house was quiet again. The noise and chaos had disappeared, and I was left standing in the middle of my dining room trying to process what had just happened. In the aftermath, some of my relatives were furious. They said I overreacted, that I was too rigid, that I should have just let it go, but I don't think I was being unreasonable. I had set boundaries, and they crossed them. I had tried to handle the situation calmly, but they didn't respect my wishes. I'm not going to apologize for sticking to what I felt was right now. I'm sitting here wondering if I really did the right thing. Maybe I could have handled it differently. But in the end, I didn't want to compromise my values or my comfort, so now I'm left to wonder. Was I wrong for kicking everyone out of my house on Thanksgiving? Update 1: the next morning was one of those quiet, heavy mornings where you wake up and the first thing you do is check your phone to see if the storm has passed. I had hoped that maybe, just maybe, everyone would have calmed down by the time they woke up. I was wrong the moment I opened my eyes and glanced at my phone. I saw a series of messages from my relatives. There was no good morning, no acknowledgement that we could all move past the drama of the previous night. Instead, it was just a series of angry texts, each one more heated than the last. The first message came from my cousin Vivian. It was long, filled with exclamation points and a mix of emotions. She was upset, frustrated, and if I'm being honest, blaming me for ruining everything. She accused me of overreacting, of being unreasonable, of turning what should have been a fun holiday into a huge mess. Her message was full of how I had destroyed the family atmosphere, how it was a memorable Thanksgiving. For all the wrong reasons, it was clear that she was angry, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of bewilderment in her mind. The problem wasn't that they had disrespected my home and my wishes. The problem was that I had kicked them out, and then, as if one wasn't enough, the messages started flooding in from other relatives, aunts, cousins, and even a few distant family members who had been at the house the night before. Each of them had their own version of the story, and none of them were happy with me. They all seemed to have the same theme running through their texts. I had ruined the holiday. I was too rigid and too controlling. I was accused of being inconsiderate, and what stung the most was when they said I lacked the holiday spirit. How could I not just let loose and let the celebration continue, especially when everyone was just looking for a good time? My phone continued buzzing, and the more I read, the more the anger I had suppressed the night before started to bubble up. They didn't get it. They weren't seeing the full picture. All they could focus on was that I had made a stand and stuck to my principles. They were upset because I had forced them to respect the boundaries I had set. And yet, I was the one who had ruined Thanksgiving. It felt like they didn't understand how much I had invested in making the night work in the first place. I wasn't going to let them rewrite the narrative in their favor. I had already been mentally preparing for the onslaught of phone calls I was sure to receive, and it didn't take long for the first one to come in. It was my aunt, the one who had let the friends into my house the night before. She was upset, but also somewhat caught off guard by the fact that I had stood my ground. The way she saw it, she was just trying to make the night more fun for everyone. But she didn't see that by doing that, she had completely disregarded my wishes. Her tone was a mixture of frustration and disbelief. She couldn't understand why I couldn't just be more flexible. She felt that I had taken something small and turned it into a huge issue. To her, my decision to kick everyone out was an overreaction, and she couldn't believe that I'd let a few uninvited guests derail everything. I let her vent for a while, But as the conversation went on, I couldn't help but start defending my decision. I explained once again that if they hadn't invited all these extra people, we could have kept the evening going smoothly. My point was simple. I had everything under control until they decided to bring in uninvited guests. If they had respected my wishes, we wouldn't have had this problem. I reminded her that this wasn't just about me being rigid or not wanting to have fun. It was about my home and my rules. I wasn't about to let them turn my Thanksgiving into something chaotic just because they wanted to have a bigger party. But as expected, she didn't take it well. She told me that I was being selfish, that I was taking everything too personally, and that I had completely ruined the holiday for everyone. It stung. The more she went on, the more I realized she wasn't really listening to me. She wasn't seeing it from my perspective. She was just trying to make herself feel better for what had happened. As soon as we hung up, the calls and messages continued. Every relative I had heard from the night before was now calling one by one. Each conversation felt like a replay of the first one, with slight variations, but all carrying the same underlying message. They were angry at me for ruining Thanksgiving. I listened, but honestly, I couldn't bring myself to apologize. What was I apologizing for? For standing up for myself? For asserting my boundaries? No, that wasn't something I was going to apologize for. By mid-afternoon, I was completely exhausted from trying to explain myself. The thing that frustrated me the most was how no one seemed to get the bigger picture. It wasn't about the food. It wasn't about who could come over and who couldn't. It was about respect. It was about my home. I had invited family to celebrate with me, and I expected my space to be respected. I didn't want a surprise party. I didn't want a crowd of strangers in my house. And I didn't want to be put in the position where I had to kick people out just to regain control of my own evening. They couldn't seem to grasp that simple concept. They just kept insisting that I was being unreasonable and rigid. As the day wore on, I started to feel a strange sense of relief. I wasn't going to let their guilt trips change how I felt about the situation. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling of sadness that hung over me. I had spent so much time and energy getting everything right for everyone, and in return, it felt like my family didn't care about my feelings or my boundaries. All they cared about was their own fun and their own convenience. I think what hurt the most was that they couldn't see how much this meant to me. Thanksgiving wasn't just about food or who was invited. It was about spending quality time with the people I cared about, in a setting where we could all be comfortable and enjoy each other's company. But they had turned it into something else. They didn't respect my wishes, and now they were turning the blame on me. It felt like they were gaslighting me into believing that I was the one who had caused the problem. Later that night, I received another message. It was a group chat with my family, and it was clear that they had been talking about me behind my back. The message was a little more composed than the earlier ones, but the tone was still the same. They wanted me to understand that I had ruined the holiday for everyone, and that it wasn't just about my house. It was about the fact that I had deprived them of a good time. I was asked to apologize, and in no uncertain terms, they made it clear that my actions were unforgivable in their eyes. I sat there, staring at my phone, feeling this strange mix of anger, hurt, and frustration. But I didn't respond. I didn't want to feed into their drama anymore. What I needed was space to process everything, and that's where I'm at now. Sitting here, trying to piece together what happened, and whether I made the right call. The more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that I did the right thing. I set a boundary and I stuck to it. I didn't let my relatives walk all over me. And I didn't let them turn my Thanksgiving into something I wasn't comfortable with. I still believe that if they had respected my wishes, everything would have gone smoothly. But now, all I can do is wait and see if they'll come around and see it from my side, or if this will just be one more chapter in the never-ending family drama. Update 2. The week following Thanksgiving was a strange one. There was a definite shift in the air. What had started as a family holiday gathering had turned into an ongoing battle over boundaries, respect, and frankly, just simple decency. While I had hoped things would settle down after I stood my ground and made it clear I wasn't going to apologize for my actions, it seemed like my relatives had other plans. I could feel the tension building, the undercurrent of resentment, from the family slowly seeping into every interaction. They weren't letting it go. At first, it seemed like things were quieting down. There were no more phone calls or texts, and I thought maybe they were finally realizing that I wasn't the villain in this situation. But the silence was deceptive. There was something simmering beneath the surface, something that made me uneasy but unsure of how to address it. I just hoped that eventually, things would return to normal and we could all move on. That was, until one morning, nearly a week after Thanksgiving, when I woke up to a scene I could never have predicted. It was early, just as the sun was starting to rise, and I was having my usual cup of coffee, enjoying the peaceful quiet of the morning. But that tranquility was shattered when I stepped outside onto my porch to find the entire front yard littered with trash. It wasn't just a few pieces of garbage either. The entire yard was covered in discarded plastic bottles, old fast food wrappers, broken bits of furniture, and even empty beer cans. It was like someone had gone out of their way to make the yard look like a landfill. But what really stopped me in my tracks was the large, bold phrase painted on the fence, in garish, bright red letters, "Holiday Destroyer." Of what I was seeing, my heart sank. This was no accident. It didn't take long for the realization to hit me, like a punch to the gut. This was a message, a direct attack from my family. I don't know what I was expecting, but this was something else entirely. The anger and frustration I had felt in the past few days suddenly flared up again, stronger than before. The sense of violation was overwhelming. Someone had deliberately gone out of their way to make me feel humiliated, to make sure I knew they hadn't forgotten what had happened. And from the nature of it all, it was clear who had done it. My aunt, the one who had let the uninvited guests into my home, was the first person who came to mind. She was the one who had been the most vocal in the aftermath, the one who had tried to justify her actions and make it all seem like my fault. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. She had orchestrated this. The trash, the insult, on my fence. It all screamed of her level of immaturity and bitterness. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't let this get to me, not when I had already made it clear that I wasn't going to back down. The problem was that the trash and graffiti weren't just a minor annoyance. They were a deliberate act of disrespect. My yard, my home, was a reflection of me, and this wasn't something I was going to tolerate. I had a decision to make, and it didn't take me long to come to the conclusion that this wasn't something I could ignore. I called the car service and arranged for a pickup. I wasn't going to clean up the mess myself. No, I was going to send it right back where it came from. The moment the car arrived, I began loading up the trash. It felt cathartic in a way. Each piece I picked up, each bit of garbage that went into the car, felt like I was reclaiming control. This was my home, and I wasn't going to let anyone disrespect it like this. The car was loaded, and I drove to my aunt's house. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't need to explain myself. As I pulled into her driveway, the car full of the garbage from my yard, I couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between my well-kept neighborhood and the chaotic mess I was about to unload. I backed the car up near her garage, and before I even got out, I saw her standing at the window watching. She knew what was coming. I didn't give her a chance to respond. I began unloading the trash in her yard, piece by piece. There was a certain satisfaction in watching the mess pile up, as though I was taking back everything she had tried to ruin. It wasn't an angry act, though it might have seemed that way. It was deliberate, calculated. I wasn't going to let her get away with this, and I certainly wasn't going to let her get away with painting me as the villain in this story. As I unloaded the last piece of trash, I turned and walked back to the car, feeling a sense of finality. I had done what I needed to do. No words were exchanged, no shouting, no arguments. It was enough. Over the next few days, I could feel the shift in my family dynamic. Word of what had happened spread fast, and reactions were mixed. Some of my relatives were horrified, shocked that things had escalated to this point. They couldn't believe what my aunt had done, and they were uncomfortable with the idea of anyone having to take revenge on someone else. They called me, some apologizing for what had happened, others expressing their confusion. The most surprising part was that no one had expected me to react the way I did. I wasn't sure if they were more shocked by the fact that I had sent the garbage to my aunt's house or by the fact that I had done it calmly and without hesitation. But there were also those who continued to side with my aunt. They saw what I did as petty, as an overreaction, and they didn't understand why I had to make a spectacle of it. To them, it was just a prank, a way to get back at someone who had hurt my feelings. But those were the people who still couldn't see the bigger picture. They didn't understand that this wasn't about a personal vendetta. It was about standing up for myself and my home. I had set a boundary, and when that boundary was crossed, I made it clear there would be consequences. My aunt never apologized, and neither did anyone else who had sided with her. But what followed after that day was a shift that I couldn't ignore. The family dynamic, though still a little tense, had changed. No one dared to overstep in my home again. The message had been made loud and clear. If you want to be part of my life, respect my space, respect my boundaries, and respect my rules. Months passed, and while the Thanksgiving incident remained a point of discussion in the family, it never reached the level of conflict it once had. There was a quiet understanding that things had shifted. The lesson, though unspoken, was learned by everyone who had been involved. You do not disrespect me or my home without facing the consequences. My aunt didn't cause trouble again. The family stopped making excuses for her behavior, and though we never fully healed from the rift, I had regained the peace I had lost that Thanksgiving. I had stood my ground, and the fallout was worth it. No one would ever break the rules in my house again.